Hello, YouTubers, Renter Patriots, Bootlickers, Shills, Death Slayers, Peasants, Vassals, Minions, Meat Sacks, Yumpin' Yemenis. I'm a useful idiot, welcome. And today I want to talk about Yemen. And here we have another clusterfuck to add to the United States list of foreign policy blunders. And in this case, we have another country. You know, sometimes you look around the world, and it's not like the good old days. It seems like every country we touch, at least in North Africa and the Middle East, turns to shit. And we have Libya as an example. We have Syria as an example. We have Iraq as an example. Any number of countries as an example. And now Yemen joins that list. So the recent sequence of events is the government has now more or less fallen, although mostly it's cabinet members who have resigned, the prime minister resigned, the president's resigned, and now the parliament's left to pick up the pieces. But now the capital is occupied by the Houthis, and we have a really interesting dynamic in going on in Yemen. I've done numerous videos before about Yemen and the buildup of U.S. presence there, the U.S. war there, and so I won't regurgitate the material from there. But let's go through the sequence of events of what we have right now. So in 2011, we had the presidential palace was rocketed, and Saleh, the then president, was nearly killed. Let's remember that Saleh was in power for 30 years and was only recently replaced by another even more compliant U.S. puppet, this guy named Hadi. And now Hadi has resigned. But in 2011, Yemen was one of the countries that had a Arab Spring. A lot of people don't know that the government there was toppled as well. And Saleh finally stepped down after 30 years, after 2 million people marched. And then the parliament in 2012 granted Saleh immunity because those elites always protect their own, just because like we see in Egypt now, with Mubarak now off the hook, thanks to the military government and all his pals. So then in 2012 they had an election. Hadi was re-elected by 99%, so no fraud in that election. And then within a few weeks there was multiple suicide attacks with over 300 Yemeni troops killed. And it's around this time that U.S. drone strikes started. And that's one of the interesting things about the U.S. war there. This is the U.S. experiment with no boots on the ground. There's been 118 drone strikes. Interestingly, all of them under Obama except for one. So President Bush authorized one drone strike in Yemen, a very infamous one. And then all the other 118 have been under Obama. 800 people killed. And so somewhat of war. This is the new blueprint for the new war with special ops and drone strikes and keeping accountability and oversight to a minimum. So anyway, once the drone strikes began, of course, we had a lot more suicide bombings and attacks. And in fact, when Obama took office, there were only 300 Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, and now there's 700 or more. And I found that figure very telling, because it's amazing when you talk about certainly a country the size of Yemen, although it's a lot of it is a wasteland. 300 to 700 Al-Qaeda members can theoretically hold an entire nation hostage, although they haven't been that successful in Yemen. But more importantly, the United States has to maintain a global empire and spend the kind of money, the taxpayer money that's spent in a place like Yemen to go after a mere handful in the hopes of ever eradicating a group that's that small to begin with, or near zero. So in 2014, Hadi tried to face off some of the forces that have come into play now by federalizing Yemen and creating 6 big regions. We have to remember that previously Yemen was in 3 pieces and was united into one country, Yemen. But I'll get into that in a minute. Let's finish this sequence. In 2014, the U.S. war in Al-Qaeda in Yemen continues. And in September of 2014, last year, there was a ceasefire when the Houthis pretty much duplicated what they're doing now, putting pressure on the government and occupying the capital. And they even managed to kidnap the chief of staff this last January and take the presidential palace, which has resulted in what we've seen happening right now. And so to give you a little background on what forces we have in play in Yemen, we have the Houthis, who are Shiites, and they normally hold what is North Yemen. And then we have Sunni tribesmen in the south, called, and there's a Iraq militant movement there looking to reclaim southern Yemen as a separate country, which it was for many years. And then we have the Al-Qaeda elements who are fighting both the government and the Houthis. So it's rather interesting that we find, once again, this situation where the United States theoretically would be supporting the Houthis because they are the ones who are fighting Al-Qaeda as well as the government. But of course, right now it's hard to say who the United States supports. Generally, the government, and right now there isn't much of a government there. And there's always been a lot of talk about a connection to Iran, and I'm sure it's tenuous at best. The fact that there's 300 to 700 Al-Qaeda running around Yemen makes any point being made by some kind of Iran connection. I've seen every Western article maintains there's a staunch Iran connection, providing no evidence whatsoever. And then more open-minded media tends to say there is no connection established per se. But another reason, of course, Yemen is in the limelight right now is because it was the militant attack in Paris, the Charlie Hebdo killings. They partially were in response to what's going on in Yemen. Some Yemen nationalists involved in that attack. But let's go back, like I said before, to a little bit of history before I give the big picture on what matters about Yemen and what's going on there now. So it's twice the size of Wyoming, so it's rather larger or smaller than you probably thought it was. Population is about 26 million, and unemployment is 18%. And generally, the country is one of the poorest in the region, with farmers, herders, and craftsmen mostly. They're Arab and they're Muslim, and so anyway, sizable population of Shiites and Sunnis, as we've seen that same dynamic all over the region. And just to give you an idea how dire the position of Yemen is, and it's predicted in 2017 that they're going to run out of water in the capital, and that the country will run out of oil. So they had oil resources at one point that have continued to be depleted. And as mentioned earlier, there used to be 3 different countries: North Yemen, South Yemen, and the Yemen Arab Republic. And in 1990, they all became one country, the Republic of Yemen. And there are still tensions pushing it back into those 3 separate regions, which probably made sense in the first place. In 1993, they had their elections, and that's when Saleh was elected, I believe. No, you'd have to be elected earlier than that, because he was in office for 30 years. But then 1994, the inevitable civil war. 1998, increased militant Islamism. And in 1999, Ali Abdullah Saleh wins the election. And again, and in 2000, the border is settled with Saudi Arabia. So up to that point, the border was rather tenuous. And then Yemen certainly became prominent in U.S. media in 2000 with the USS Cole bombing occurring there. And then in 2004, there was a rebellion in North Yemen, and we see that the results of that rebellion continuing here now 10, 11 years later. So this dynamic between the Houthis and the government, the Sunnis in the south, has been going on for quite some time. And then in 2008, interestingly, there was a bombing of the U.S. Embassy, the fourth time since 2003 that the embassy in Yemen had been bombed. And then in 2010 is when the U.S. Started its intervention with drones, and then in 2011 the Arab Spring. And one story I did a report on some time back that it was a published article, and I never heard much more about it, and I don't know if there's much veracity to it. But at the time, this was in June 2013, supposedly there was 1,500 U.S. combat troops sent there, and probably inevitably as advisors and or special ops. And anyway, they could very well still be there, although considering the situation there now, it's pretty dangerous. So anyway, the big picture for Yemen is that here we have yet another country that the U.S. meddled in, and it may or may not have exacerbated the situation that already existed. Certainly when you look at the historical facts and the lead up to the events that we have now, it almost seems inevitable. And we see these kind of things cycled again and again, and we see the same Sunni and Shiite dynamic. Although it's kind of interesting because the Houthis apparently are saying, at least right now, they don't really want to take political power and run the country. One of their demands, which seemed fairly reasonable, was just more representation in the government for the Houthis. And so anyway, and then we have this Al Qaeda element, which, however meager, seems to justify a huge amount of American presence there, at least drone presence. And so this is also, like I mentioned earlier, a blueprint for the kind of wars that America is waging in a lot of different countries around the world, actually, right now, and will serve as a model for the future. But in the meantime, we have this country that has had Saudi Arabia intervene before militarily, and we could easily see a Saudi Arabian intervention if things get out of control in Yemen. Although right now it seems like the Houthis, although violence has upticked in the last few days, the Houthis seem to have things relatively under control. But anyway, there we have another country to kind of keep on our radar right now, as it seems to be collapsing. So we have a failed state that is collapsing even further. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too?